Feminine intuition isn't defeated or overpowered by masculine rationality. Intuition is a complement to intellect, and it's time to learn how to nourish your soul via the dual integration of both the feminine and masculine forms of experience, perception, and self-expression. Although this video might be useful for a certain type of man at a certain season in his life, this video is primarily intended for women who've already spent several years cultivating their feminine energy and are looking to integrate their self-expression at a higher level of character development. So a quick disclaimer, this video is probably not the right fit for men or women who are still trying to understand the basics of their feminine essential foundation, because what we're going to be talking about today is the role of feminine assertiveness, which isn't to be confused with boss bitch ball crusher, put on the fake pair of prosthetic testicles and go out into the workplace and destroy all the men that you encounter. We're talking about the assertiveness of the feminine heart, which requires the foundation of the receptivity principle, which is the commonplace language around feminine energy, that womb-like, soft, life-giving, nurturing quality which you've read about and heard about many, many times. But before we get in, just in case someone is watching this video and they're not familiar with feminine energy, I've got a nice little stack right here of some recommended feminine psychology reading. We've got some classics in here, like Goddesses in Every Woman, and we've also got people like Robert Johnson, the Jungian psychologist. We've got Women Who Run with Wolves, which is very popular, although I don't actually recommend it too much. It's not necessarily that useful. And of course, the favorite, Marion Woodman, Pregnant Virgin, and The Ravaged Bridegroom, which talks about masculinity in women, and Sidra Stone's The Shadow King. These three books alone, if you would pause this video and buy these books, if you're interested in feminine psychology, not only at foundation, but the higher levels, I recommend these books, because this video isn't going to be going into any detail in regards to the literature, because today's question specifically invited a way of evolving our femininity without going to the literature. So let me get this up for you. The question that I received in this question and answer series, feel free to get involved. Pinned comment down below has the guidelines for the series. Following question. I got asked, I've never been attracted to an overabundance of reading. I prefer the blind experiential journey and to seek material after if necessary. What are your thoughts on the feminine as the experience or embodied, and masculine as the observer/knowledge? And then a bit more personal elaboration. Thank you for the question. I remember responding to this question a few weeks ago as a comment response, and I very naturally said, well, I think it's time to go beyond the dichotomy and the split objectification of masculine rationality and feminine intuition. My previous video that I just released on masculine emotional receptivity tackled the male half of this question, because I was talking about the importance of men being able to emotionally receive into their heart the experience of the world around them. And this definitely applies in leadership, romance, and family, and also a man's relationship to God or his personal spiritual belief system. The male principle receives into the heart and he exerts out of the genitals, the phallic principle. Of course, we have an inversion with the female principle, which is receiving through the womb, and of course, asserting through the heart, which is the core idea in this video. The question itself is multi-layered, and there's many directions I could take it, but I really wanted to strip back the dichotomy into this idea of playing with something beyond the typical duality of masculinity and femininity. Frankly, I want to do this because I find it pretty boring at this stage, based on how much I've read, how common the conversation is, and although it is truly a foundational understanding which cannot, and I mean cannot be bypassed in the same way that a man cannot healthily, the majority of men, and I mean 99.8% of men, cannot bypass the masculine self-initiation of striving, exerting, and asserting themselves into the world in a way which gives gifts to their community. A woman, 99.8% of women, will be psychologically at their healthiest when they've already built a foundation of receiving life and being in that nourishing, connective, circular consciousness which flows with the seasons, flows with the moon, and of course their own 28-day, more or less, menstrual cycle. All it takes is a woman to read a book like Wild Power or get into menstrual cycle psychology to realize that their 4 inner seasons, moving towards ovulation and then moving towards their bleed, create real psychological changes which can impact the whole way that they structure their life. Masculine linearity, feminine, seasonal, cyclicality. But at a certain point, these dichotomies stop being interesting. They're no longer useful for someone who's several years deep into their self-identity expression. We need something which really crosses the boundaries, but doesn't do the mistaken pre-trans fallacy, is what Ken Wilber calls it, of trying to lump everything together as if it were the same. We still need the distinction. We still need to define where masculinity roughly operates and where femininity roughly operates. But my invitation for any woman watching this video is that you do not need to integrate your masculine to learn how to be a feminine woman who can assert into the world in a way which isn't pushy or boss bitch mentality, but asserts via the principle of compassion and life-giving nourishment. If you want to make it very literal, it's literally the moment of birth. What do we say to a woman who hopefully is having a home birth with beautiful people around her and maybe great medical care in a hospital if she hasn't got that option? We say push. Push. And why push? Why the masculine principle at the most feminine moment of a woman's life, biologically speaking? She asserts through her womb. The womb isn't just an organ or a psychological space that receives. It creates, it gestates, and at that final moment, 9 months in, there's a push. There's an assertive, feminine push. And that is the foundation for all of the life that we experience on this beautiful planet. So how do we extend that idea even further out? I'd argue it's about the womb consciousness, but also the heart consciousness, and we don't need to go into the intellect too much right now. Of course, I recommend that every single brilliant, gifted woman who may be watching this video should obviously have a well-developed logical capacity in the same way that every man eventually will work on his own emotional capacity. I hope it's clear, so don't jump into the comments that I'm oversimplifying. It is a very complex kind of dichotomy transcendent moment that I'm trying to speak towards. The assertiveness of the feminine heart is the principle which seems to operate at the higher levels of feminine moral character development, because it's the same energy which leads social movements such as the abolition of the slave trade. I studied history back in university, and although it was only up until 1807 when in the UK at the very least the slave trade was outlawed, and then Britain starts policing the oceans, and I don't need to get into the history of it, there was a 120-year period before that started to gain momentum, roughly in the 1780s for the final 30 years or so, where women, primarily very well-educated women from admittedly rich aristocratic privileged backgrounds, were leading through the compassion and the assertion of their heart towards a movement which admittedly required male power and admittedly required a collaboration between the genders, nonetheless changed the course of human history. There's never been a period in time, to my awareness, having studied history, and although we may go retroactively look back 10,000 years and be like, wow, the matriarchal, great mother cultures that existed where everything was romantic bliss and we all held hands and put flowers in our hair. That's a New Age fantasy. Slavery has always existed, but just at smaller scales within human cultures because of how masculine aggression works. I don't need to go into the whole history. Bit of a rant there. The point that I'm trying to get into is that we have such a beautiful legacy 200 years later, although slavery still exists in the world and it's a really complex issue. I don't know everything about it. The core moment somewhere in the British Isles with these small groups of mainly women coming together for generations to try and petition against the slave trade was what created the ripples for the abolition across Europe and also in the Americas. And isn't that inspiring? It's not masculine rationality, and it's not just the feminine, nurturing, womb-like wisdom that we read so much about. It's something which is really fierce and powerful, but not phallic like a sword, but softer at the edges. It's something like a beam of light, not to get too new age, but a radiance of the heart which warms and inspires and becomes life-giving to the world around her. That's what I think women need at the higher levels of development. It's being a leader from the heart, as overly cliche as that language is. It's to assert via intuition and intellect combined, but primarily in a distinctly feminine way. In my video on masculine emotional receptivity, I didn't suggest for men to go and integrate their feminine and read books like Goddesses and Every Woman and integrate the feminine archetypes so that they could become more of a man. There's a language trap that I see taking place in roughly the last 5 years or so, which is a wonderful, healthy splitting between the polarities of divine masculine, divine feminine, or conscious masculine, conscious feminine, and then there's a nice relational culture that seems to be emerging where men and women can come together in new sexual partnerships just on the romantic front and have a really wonderfully conscious, communicative, highly charged, multifaceted relationship while also honoring, of course, their inner man or inner woman and all of the parts work-based ideas that I talk about on this channel so often. And yet, there is a way to develop which doesn't require partnership or completion with another man or another woman, or an active receptivity of a different energetic complement to yourself. It can be asserted via the individual. Of course, I'm not saying that we're human beings who live on islands and we should be lone wolves in the world. I'm not saying that the feminine assertive principle requires an isolation from community, because of course, primarily, it breaks through the boundaries, the artificial boundaries. We don't need to go into any over-the-top idea about the patriarchal culture. There are many wonderful, wonderful benefits in the patriarchal culture, many very difficult challenges, but in terms of safety and order and structuring and the ability to even watch a video like this, we have to thank the patriarchal culture, and we can't regress to a matriarchal culture either. This is a really mistaken anthropological idea that somehow we're going to shift from patriarchy to matriarchy, or the goddess rising movement is going to dethrone the God movement of the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's not the case. We bridge between the worlds in a way which includes both. We have the spiral of development from masculine to feminine, but as it gets to that higher band, hopefully you're following me, I'm getting a bit animated. As it gets to the higher band, the distinction between the two starts to break down. The reason I held up these books, go back if you want to and buy a few of these, is that the intellectual understanding of the feminine energy, and often when you have a female thinker, they'll write in more poetry, more sensual language. That's communicated both through the intellect and through the embodied experience. So we don't need to make the distinction in the same way that we shouldn't say that men are primarily intellectual beings. Sure, some men might be very linear-minded, engineer, mathematician kind of types. And yet a lot of men that I'm friends with are very deeply emotional. They're very deeply into their creativity, and myself as a man who would like to imagine I'm decently well-rounded, I don't like the ideas. I think the language is really oversimplified, and if all that lands from this video, for a woman watching this video, is that you can have assertion from the heart, which is not the equivalent of putting on a prosthetic cock and going out there to fuck everyone that you meet and get back psychologically over the wounds that we've suffered from masculinity, men and women alike, then you'll unlock something like a much more powerful way of showing up in the world without becoming the same dominating force, which you might also privately completely despise. How do you stop that shadow fulfillment? You don't put on the prosthetic, and men themselves have their own work where they're learning how to go away from that linearly dominating kind of cut-through energy into something which is more heart-based. Ultimately, for both men and women, we both need the power of a truly healed, alert, connective, and receptive heart. We've got a conversation around the soul, and there's a conversation around spirit, and the psychological conversations around the persona, the psyche, the multiplicity of the subpersonalities, and everything that I love talking about on this channel. But if you're a woman at a certain moment in her journey, and you want to step into that next level of power without stripping it away from men or needing to play these lower level games where you're headbutting against lower levels of psychological immaturity, elevate yourself out of that same immaturity without aiming downwards in a punitive way, and actually let that assertion of the heart be the guiding light which breaks the barriers and shifts the narrative slowly, incrementally, in a way which is truly loving. It's the best principle of motherhood. It's truly being compassionate. It's having the patience for the men and the women in the world, and yourself, of course, primarily, that we will continually fuck up, and we are quite crazy beings who all have our own trauma work to work through over many years and sometimes decades. We're all struggling, but the heart can be the anchor which helps us to alleviate some of that pain. And I'd love to see more of that in the world, from women who really show up in their brilliance and their power to create movements and ripples just like the slave trade abolition, which may take another 150 years to see. That's my message. That's my response. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you haven't watched my previous video on masculine receptivity and emotional maturity, you can watch it over here. These two videos really go together like peaches and cream, I suppose, to randomly make it sensual. I'll see you over there.